So the first speaker is Dr. Bharat Gurnani.
Yeah.
He'll be talking to us about innovative lens loading, magnified and anti-fogging solution for microscope and spectacle fogging during COVID-19.
Good evening, sir. Should I share my
Yeah,
screen?
Dr. Bharat,
Please.
yeah, please do.
First of all, I would like to thank All India Ophthalmic Society, Dr. Cheta Jadev ma'am, Dr. Rohit Chetty sir, Dr. Suven sir, and Dr. Trilmahesh sir for giving me opportunity to speak here. I'll be discussing two basic innovation on the behalf of my team. Like first one is a small, simple solution to prevent microscopic eyepiece fogging and spectacle fogging in COVID-19 era. We have no financial disclosures to make. So, what are the challenges while performing surgery? Despite extensive and brisk developments in ocular surgery, surgeons continue to face recurrent fogging of spectacles and microscope eyepieces while performing surgery. Even during this COVID-19 pandemic, the surgeons are now wearing masks and face shield, and fogging seems to be a major issue. Other important issues faced like reduced stereo acuity, application of plastic tape over the surgical mask in order to avoid fogging, fogging of the teaching binoculars like side scope while teaching. Sometimes surgeons lower the upper mask strap to encourage easy breathing also. And there is sometimes need for cleaning the microscope binocular multiple times in between the surgery. So this was our problem statement. We came with a small solution, like we searched for a lot of solution. We came up this, we bought this a small medical integrate fogging solution comes by the name of Dr. Fog in the market, and there is a sponge available with it for application. So this anti-fog solution can be procured as a spray or a pre-moistened solution from the market at an inexpensive cost. And suppose this is not available, there are now a lot of local these anti-fogging solutions available, which can be easily obtained. So how to apply? The solution is applied with a sterilized dry cotton swab or sprayed directly onto the eyepieces. Then the eyepiece is cleaned with a sponge provided with the solution and allowed to draw. So how it has helped? It improves clarity by forming a uniform layer over the eyepiece. We have not seen any scratches over the optical devices. It holds good for around 5 to 6 hours, so can be used again, and like 50 to 70 applications from a bottle. Clear unobstructed view has been seen throughout the cases. The spectacle surgeons have also found it beneficial, and there is no need for plastic tape applications also. And this can be used for defogging the face shields, slit lamp eyepieces, fundus lenses, refraction, even glasses. So this is a simple and innovative reproducible technique. It can help in maximizing surgical output, minimize complications during surgery, and even can be a boon for workers during the growing pandemic. The second one I'm coming is an innovative intraocular lens loading magnified. So what are the challenges faced by the ophthalmic assistant or the nurse while loading the IOL? Since they don't have access to the microscope, they rely solely on their unaided vision to load the IOL. And sometimes the operation theaters are dimly lit and even they have time constraint due to surgery. So this can lead to improper loading, sudden extrusion of intraocular lens during injection, or even trailing actives getting jammed or damaged. Sudden extrusions can lead to complications like DMD, PCR, or zonular dialysis also. Other challenges faced like IOL can drop on the table or on the floor. They sometimes can be loaded upside down. And while they are loading with the naked eye, broken haptics or optics can be overlooked. Some places the surgeons are also loading the IOL. In case the ophthalmic surgeon loads the IOL, the flow of surgery will be interrupted if he has to accommodate to change the focus from surgery to IOL. If you wish to load the IOL on the surgical trolley, or the surgeon has to adjust the focus of the microscope, that is best for loading the IOL and back again. And the microscope sometimes have a smaller field of view, thus making the IOL loading difficult. So the IOL sometimes gets engaged in the cartridge, making unloading and loading also difficult. In case the IOL breaks, slips or struck, sometimes the backup IOL is not available, and then it becomes difficult to move the surgery. And even while performing high volume cataract surgery, adds to extra time during surgery. So we came up with a smaller solution. Like we obtained this magnifier from the market. It is easily available online for 700 rupees to 800 rupees. It can be attached to one side of the trolley. It has a flexible string that can be moved and can be moved towards the table. In the first image, as you can see, the ophthalmic assistant loading the IOL, and like she's injecting the viscoelastic. In the next image, she has already loaded with comfort. This image shows the magnification factor, like 3 times the magnification we get what we get from the naked eye. This also has a small LED inbuilt it, so that when the illumination is less, we can use this LED light for our benefit. And you can see how it has been attached like a jugaad. From we have taken a metal clip. There is a small hole. It can be bent. And even this even we use a sterilized plastic drape to cover the metal prong, so that the sterilization part is taken care of. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, you're muted.
Question.
Speaker, are you aware of how much time you allotted to speak? Thiru, do you have any idea?
So 5 minutes for speakers.
5
and
minutes.
2 minutes for discussion.
Yeah, okay, fine. So there was a question from one of the participants.
Yes,
So, and I think Divyansh, are you in? Somebody wanted to get in. You should have a link.
I'm here, sir. Yeah, yes, sir.
Yeah, so yeah, you can share your screen. In the meantime, Bharat, this solution that you talked is available off the counter, and it's basically what's its surfactant, is it? It's a soap
sir,
solution, detergent solution.
No, sir. Actually, we went onto the website. We tried to find out what exactly it is. The company has not disclosed what it is made of. Actually, we thought it was an alcoholic or maybe a sterilized. Like the contents are not available on the online. We try to search a lot what it is made of.
How much does it cost? How much does it cost?
Sir, this anti-fogging solution costs around 200 to 300, but now there are cheaper solutions available around 100 rupees. Also, we can get from the markets.
And you've tried and tested that does not damage the microscope or
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We have been using it with comfort. There is no like complaints until now.
right. Nice job.
Thank you.
I think
Thank
it's
you.
Can I ask a quick question, sir?
Yes, sir.
sure.
So have you any experience of putting it on the biome lens for VR surgeries?
Like biome lens, we have not tried, sir. Like since like the actually we had submitted this and we published this. That time the same query came from the reviewer. He asked it, but since this solution can't be sterilized, so we have not tried it on biome yet. If it in future we can sterilize it, we can try it on biome also. Probably.
Fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
If it's alcohol based and it evaporates, there wouldn't be any issue of that sterilizing part actually.
Yes.
So anyway, that I think VR surgeons will probably know their comfort zone. So
Yes.
can we ask Divyansh to start? Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, good evening all. Thanks, Dr. Chaitra and Dr. Rohit for this opportunity. So my topic for presentation for today is cost is not an issue when it costs just a pittance. So we come to it. No financial disclosures, as I have not earned much out of it, or I would say nothing. Just to give a background that this was a time when the lockdown was there. Yes, this is when it started 23rd of March. Usually our OPD is pretty busy. In 2019, yes, as we can see, the OPD is really busy. But in 2020, because of the lockdown and the after effects, it was nearly empty. And why this preclude is because of this, that the need of the question was, there was a case-based examination or a DNB practical examination which had to be conducted at our center. So the questions were how to manage it. Do we give them charts like this for retina and then show it to them what it is? Do we give them slides and show it to them, or do we give them printouts? All these issues was that at that point of time, the fear was so much that because everyone wanted to be safe as possible, not come to maintaining distance at least 6 meters or 3 meters at least, not touching objects. So how to give them that kind of a safe environment so that they can show their skill of examination and still we can evaluate them. So then came this answer in our mind that it can be a safe eye examination, which is C. How did we go about it? So no personal interest in this. We utilized this RetiEye. We thought whether, because this already has some kind of a template inside, can that be used for an examination? So what we thought is whether we can replicate the same kind of a image what we have of a fundus photo having a pathological images over there, but usually not. So whatever was recreated was not as well, because as we know, what we expect is not always we get. We thought it's probably because of the dark colors, but the problem was even the lighter colors were much worse, like yellow, orange, white. Those were not seen much well because the template itself was having some orange color. So we thought, why not to put a photograph inside? So we identified the diameter of this bowl, which was 30 mm, so around 3 centimeters. So we marked this was the first printout. As we can see, it's of a very poor quality. We cut the edges, but when we put this inside, there was a lot of folds. So what we thought was, let's try some better printing. So we tried on better printing like gloss paper, matte paper, butter paper, more better GSM 125 quality, and various papers were evaluated on this image scale by at least 2 consultants and 2 fellows to understand which is working well. Then we identified that the matte is working well, and that's how we started with it. That, as you can see over here, that the images are made in a circle of 30 mm, and those are cut, and the edges have to be really cut in a round shape, and there needs to be having a small crescent at the edge which has cuts on the 4 sides, so that it can go into the convexity of that mall, as we can see. So once we remove the anterior flap, and we can see that it sits very well inside, and then we can put on the front part of the assembly, and then we can use it as an examination technique. So as we can see whether it is effective, that's what we can see in this video, that doing an indirect ophthalmoscopy, we can see the areas of pathological problems in the eye. We can identify the signs. Symptoms may not be there, but yes, at least the signs can be elicited, and then examination technique can be evaluated in indirect ophthalmoscopy. Can this be utilized in a slit lamp per se? As we can see, yes, in the slit lamp evaluation also. This is a diabetic patient where we can see hard exudates, soft exudates. And yes, in the periphery also, we can see if we increase the illumination. So it was effective in, yes, the slit lamp biomicroscopy. Whether it is effective in teaching lasers, yes, as we can see, the laser spot is very well seen over here. And once we shoot the laser, we can see there are some changes because the laser also, we can see some kind of a pigment falling from here. That is again a very good sign that the laser is taking up over there. And that is how it can be done. So we evaluated it, that whether it actually works. So 53 responses were accounted for. In that, as we can see, more than 90% of responses had very good or either no pixelation or no artifacts, and very good sharpness and contrast, as we are seeing, and good diagnostic efficacy of more than 90%. And yes, we utilized this for the same evaluation for our DNB exams, and it worked very well. And to compare with other techniques which are available, the diabetic retinopathy technique, which is only for direct, we can use it for indirect also. The disadvantage in this case is it is only for a stimulation, but in our case, there can be a live demonstration. The other stimulative videos which are available, this can be done only for a direct ophthalmoscope. We can use for direct, indirect, 90D, laser. Yes, cost is nothing at all, just the printable cost. Finally, the most important is the 3D visualization as the most important VR magic which is available, as we can see. But the laser can still not be learned in this, and only indirect is possible. Slit lamp biomicroscopy is still not possible. Yes, we are trying to publish it, and it is already accepted for the publication. Thank you, and I would like to thank all my credits to my team. Thank you again.
Thank you, Divyansh. Dr. Vaishali and Dr. Vishal, I think both of you are the most competent to ask a few questions and see how relevant this has been to all of us.
No, I think it's a great thing to do. I'm really, really impressed, Divyansh. Because what we actually have been doing is the projections using and VR magic and all, but still we are not able to do indirect. And looking at I thought we could simply start using it for.
Thank you, man. Thank you.
Virtual exams. Wonderful, wonderful.
So Divyansh, I think the next step is to make it commercially available or whatever you want. Even if I mean, there is no harm in saying that you have a financial interest. You may work on a no profit, no loss basis, but still making it available costs some money.
Sir, it's just the printing costs and nothing else.
Yeah, but you see, when you're doing it on a large scale, it's a lot easier when one station does it.
Sure, sir. We would consider that. I would discuss it, sir.
Yeah, you can make it available.
Sure, sir. Thank you.
And please gift it to PGI.
Thank you, man. Yeah, sure.
Why only to PGI, madam? Even to us also.
For everyone.
You have enough resources. You don't need it. Yeah.
Whoever have attended this session, you have to give it free, Divyansh.
Sure.
Yeah.
So one more advantage of this is we can actually show the rare images like retinoblastoma, tumors, ROPs also. And for lasers, we can utilize this for lasers, identifying whether they are doing correct lasers, whether they are. And the only disadvantage is that the wide field. So we are right now working on that, where we are montaging, because we do not have a wide field camera with us. So montage images we are working so that we can have a wider field of view, and the examination can be taken in other cases also.
I'll have a suggestion over here, Divyansh, because the thing that you lose out on a flat print is the 3D, the depth perception, because the candidate is doing an indirect during his post-graduation, and when he comes for the examination, he gets a flat image. So next, you probably take this next level and try 3D printing with 3D images. You show a raised retinoblastoma over there.
Understood, sir.
It
Very
would
true.
it would be real. It would come as close to the real one as possible.
Sure, sir. Point well taken. Sure, sir.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
Very true, sir.
Thank you. Thank you again.
Right. Can we have the next speaker? Thiru, can you please call out the next speaker? Is Amar Pujari here?
Yes, sir.
So dry eye evaluation using a smart software. Dr.
No,
Geeta,
that is not my topic, sir.
No, no. Amar Pujari is speaking on breaching the boundaries in wet lab training. Correct,
Yes.
Amar?
Yes, sir.
Yes, all yours.
Thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. I am here to present some of the things we did, which is out of usual at RP Center. So as we know, last year in March, pandemic started, but almost like for 6 months, we had so many theoretical teachings through webinar, but there was no hands-on training. So that was the real surgical task which residents were facing. So many exercises were taught and published in various international journals, but none of these were able to address the individual concern of the residents. So that is they wanted a hands-on experience of surgical things. So for that one, we needed to think out of the box. So in November 2020, we started something on working on goat's eye, because initially I'm working since 2017. I have published some of the techniques. So what I thought is I went through the literature once again, what are the techniques they have described in the literature. So when I saw that, and there were only limited number of techniques that too more related to cataract and the cornea, but rest of the techniques were lacking. So I thought on those things. So for 3 months we worked till January, and we were able to generate around 20 techniques, so which I am going to present here. So basically, initially we are going to start with extraocular muscles. So these are the extraocular muscles we can get on both sides. So this is how we can do recession surgery. You can teach it to residents, and since 4 years we are practicing. Our all senior residents and junior residents will do. They will get experience on how to pass the scleral suture, how to secure the muscle. So similarly, they can do resection as well, like this, and they can do reinforced placation. This is described by Professor Pradeep Sharma, so which we practice at RP Center. So similarly, cataract and IOL-based procedures are quite common, but majority people are just saying cataract surgery. So in addition to cataract surgery, we also taught how to put IOL in the back, in the sulcus, as well as in the entry chamber. So we here induced the posterior capsular rupture, and we made the resident to do vitrectomy and put the IOL in the entry chamber. Similarly, some of the senior residents from cataract people, they approached me, they said, sir, we want to do SFL also. So in that case, we measured the minimum horizontal width of the goat eye, that was around 14 to 15 millimeter, and that was not possible with the routine multi-piece IOL. So what we did is, like, we took another IOLs haptic, and we just joined them, so that now we can stretch them up to 16 or 17 millimeter. So that's why they are able to execute the systematic SFL in a systematic manner. So similarly, we simulated ICL also. We took a square-edged IOL. These were not ICLs, and we tried to inject, and we told them how to guide the front and the rear haptics, so that they were able to see that, okay, this is how ICL surgery is done. So similarly, corneal tattooing, which every first year senior junior resident will do. So we told them how to do a graded depth dissection, so that they can assess the depth when they are in the stroma, when they are towards the epithelium, when they are towards the endothelium. So by doing this one graded dissection, they were able to put some dye, and they were able to do a corneal tattooing kind of procedure. So similarly, some of the corneal senior residents, they were able to do a graded anticorneal dissection, that is deep interlamellar keratoplasty, using crescent blade as well as scissors. So ultimately, they were able to reach the endothelium by assessing and by gradually educating themselves. So this is full thickness keratoplasty, which is commonly described. So similarly, glaucoma here also under the like we discussed with Professor Amanjit first, then we were able to get some of the good quality eyes, and we were able to teach them how to do peritomy, limbal based or fornical based, and then how to do a graded dissection of the sclera, double layer or triple layer, even reaching the suprachoroidal space, and how to create an ostium, and how to put even releasable sutures in some clinical scenarios. So we had some of the extruded or explanted AGV walls also. We told them how to implant this one and how to create a port in the angle so that it should not touch the endothelium. Because majority of the things they are going to experience theoretically. At the same time, if you are giving a practical experience, that is going to create a better memory. So at our center, we'll get around 4 to 5 traumatic cases every day. So it's our mandatory rules that we'll teach them traumatic cases, how to repair them. So this is simple corneoscleral repair. So at the same time, we simulated the scleral perforation beyond the muscle, as well as striated corneal perforations, corneal perforation with lenticular injuries. So all sort of injuries were simulated and repaired. So similarly, we because the GO type pupil resembles like an oval pupil, so we were able to do a single pass 4 through using 90 prolines. So at the same time, in the same eye, we were able to induce the iridodialysis, and some of the residents were able to do iridodialysis repair using 90 proline. So pterygium is, as we know, it's one of the most common surgery, and we told resident how to measure the size of the defect, how to do a graded dissection, not to take the tenons, how to make a finer dissection in the conjunctiva, and how to harvest using suture, as well as sometimes glue when it is wasted or when extra glue is available. So from the harvested eyes, we some of the corneal residents, they were able to do a Descemet schooling, or they were able to take to the
Please wind up. We'll have no time left for the others otherwise.
Yes. And this is a buckling surgery. And similarly, this is EV series surgery. And these are the surgeries which I have listed and pasted as a poster in our RP center that everyone can do this one. And I compiled these 20 techniques and similarly around 60 articles in the literature. So I published this as a major review in the Survey of Ophthalmology so that every other resident can be benefited. Thank you.
Thank you. I invite any panelists to ask a question or make a comment. Any of the panelists? Because Amar has thrown it open to all subspecialties.
Yes.
There is no subspecialty which is spared in your GOAT's eye.
No, that's wonderful. Especially during this pandemic, we found our PG residents are not able to get any surgical practice. So this is
John,
going to be very
useful.
Devices. So this is going to be very
John,
useful.
you're on 2 devices. Yes. Yeah. So can we move on? Thiru, can you please check who's the next?
I think next one is Dr. Geeta here, sir. She was sharing this.
Can Dr. Geeta, are you ready? Dr. Geeta, are
Yes,
you?
yes.
Yes, please, can you share your screen? Yes, please.
Yes, I'm ready. Yes.
Please start. Please start.
So let me walk you through the Dry Eye Smart app that has been developed by us. And believe me that this is going to change the way you see and treat your dry eye patients henceforth. Recall several scenes from the past when you were examining these patients. Someone who had increased irritation post-cataract surgery. Did we look for conjunctivochalasis preoperatively, document it, and prepare the patient for worsening post-surgery? A patient of moderate dry eye with SPK is unhappy with his multifocal IOL. Did we document Schirmer's, staining, and TBAT and make an informed decision about the pros and cons of premium IOL in that patient? As a cornea specialist dealing with aqueous tear deficiency, did we miss asking for reduced tearing since birth, suggestive of congenital alacremia? Did we miss checking for corneal sensation? Did we overlook the fact that the patient is on hormone therapy that could have worsened the MGD? Do we need to refer the patient to a rheumatologist? What and how should we communicate to the rheumatologist so as to make it more relevant and effective? Is the patient on hydroxychloroquine, and what do we need to check to rule out toxicity? What blood work should we advise for if we do not have easy access to a rheumatologist? How do we explain to the patient that his signs are improving and symptom sign disconnect is normal, and several other questions? Fret no more. For this lack of a uniform reporting system with a streamlined evaluation protocol has been the large unmet need in dry eye diagnostics and management. And this precisely is what the app has attempted to bridge. Using a combination of technology, clinical expertise, clinical experience, and vast literature support that helped key in the small pieces to see the seamless bigger picture. A web-based application on the cloud has been developed for all of us to use. And here is a snippet of what it has to
Presenting
offer.
the Ocular Surface Portal Dry Eye Module, leading an innovative difference in the management and diagnosis of dry eye. A super user-friendly application made just for you that provides you with a gist of your data at a glance, with several panels that guide you and streamline your evaluation. What does the app need from you to generate a diagnostic sheet? Well, history, questionnaire, examination, a Sherman strip and a fluorescein strip in just additional 5 minutes of your time. That is all, with mind-blowing schematic illustration for every finding relevant to dry eye. What does the app give you? For the first time, a diagnostic sheet that grades the type and severity of dry eye, in addition to the contributing and confounding factors at just a click. A Cornea Rheumat interface sheet that customizes your interaction with the rheumatologist. A prescription sheet with clear instructions along with preloaded advice to choose from. Comparative examination panel that helps you see the change your treatment has made. A need of the hour signs and symptoms trend chart that helps you discuss progress objectively with your patient. And so many more features just waiting to be explored. Everything you need right at your fingertips, providing you with a uniform reporting format and improving quality of care. The unique dry eye app we have all been waiting for that bridges the gap of the unmet need.
Developed, executed and copyrighted by Shankar Nethralaya. This is an institutionally financed app with no SN branding in customized printouts. To register and sign up, log on to ocularsurfaceportal.in, and for further details, please email us to info@ocularsurfaceportal.in. Let me acknowledge the entire support team at Shankar Nethralaya, our technology partner, HNS, the closed user group that provided us with crucial feedback, and all of you who would be a part of the dry eye module user group and crucial in providing us with feedback to this app. I look forward to see you on the other side of your registration and interacting with you further. Thank you very much for a very patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Geeta. Thank you, Dr. Is Dr. Somshila here? Yeah. Is or anybody?
I am here.
Yeah. Somshila, would you like to make a comment over this on this app?
No, I think I've already gone through the app because we saw it earlier on the groups, and we never miss whatever Geeta is doing. So this is, of course, a very, very useful app, and she's just summed it up very well. I think it's a marvelous innovation.
Thanks, Somshila.
Anybody else would like to make a comment on this? Okay, if not,
the initial feedback that we have had, especially from rheumatologists, cornea colleagues, and our patients, is very, very encouraging and satisfactory. Thank you.
So this is open to all?
Just a mic test
yes,
also.
It is open to all.
I am very interested in smartphone apps, and I'm very impressed that we are having so many smartphone apps for ophthalmologists coming out. And I hope that we get more and more personalized and very innovative apps that we can use. There are so many things that we can do, which can be as something very simple, which can help in our clinical diagnosis, can help in our patient management, so many things. And this is going to be one of the tools which we have in our pocket. Thank you.
I think you're up next, John. Can you speak to us on your topic? iGrader,
yes, sir.
Clinical
yes,
ophthalmic grading at your fingertips.
Yes, sir. That is also an app. Let me just share my screen, please. Okay. Is my screen visible now?
Not yet. It's coming.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is iGrader, which is a clinical ophthalmic grading app at your fingertips. And this was from a need which I got from my postgraduate students. I keep telling my postgraduate students that they should grade everything correctly. And they said, yes. And then they try to look it up, and then finally it doesn't happen. So I said, okay, I'll make an app. If I make an app, will you do the grading? And I had to make an app. So basically, the importance of clinical grading is often not recognized. It is very important to have a good clinical grading when we are communicating with each other in across specialties, across different doctors, and we often don't do the grading properly. So why should we do it? There's no question. There are several advantages. I won't go over this because I might exceed the time. So routine documentation is not very routine. We sometimes just write very little. We don't grade properly. And that is where I wanted to make a difference. So with a little bit of help from my my school hobby, that was programming, computer programming, I made an app myself. I did not want to involve any company or anything. I used a software called PhoneGap. So if anybody who is having a hobby of doing computer programming wants to get into this, PhoneGap is a good place to start for making apps yourself. If you want to make complicated app, please go ahead and get an engineering team and software development team. But if you want to make it yourself, this is what I did. And you can use it and make for Apple, Android phones also, but there is just a higher app store fee. And this app I made in, I think, July, 2019, when I was in Little Flower Hospital, because the PGs there wanted it. And by October 2020, last time I checked, it had around 3,000 downloads from 80 countries. And now it is even more. And I keep getting all sorts of suggestions about things to add. And these are some of the things which happened on the way of me making this app. When I was in school, I made this particular game in C++. Even before this, I made something in QBasic. And then when I was in MPPS, I made a period of gestation calculation tool. And then I made several ophthalmic apps, including one during internship, because one of the postgraduates wanted an SIA calculator and the one they had did not work. So this is how the hobby becomes something which you can connect into the profession. I'll just go over the app quickly.
Open the Google Play Store and search for Eye Doctor, Dr. John's app.
This is available on the Google Play Store. You just search for iGrader, and then you will get an interface where you can either go into a particular subspecialty, or you can go and search for anything in particular. And when you search, it will show everything which starts with that same name. So that is going to be useful if you want to quickly go across it. And there are lots of gradings available, and this can be updated over the air. So if there are any changes, any additions, I can update it from my side, and you can just update the app on all the people who have downloaded the app. So that is going to be very useful. And I just want to say that use of grading scales improves the standard of record keeping, and this is important in the medical legal standpoint. It helps to standardize our findings, which leads to less inter and intra-observer variability, which is very, very much a problem. And it's very relevant when multiple clinicians are involved in patient care. In a big institute, in a postgraduate resident training institute, this is going to be very important. So yeah, I would like to just thank all the institutes which have molded me into what I am. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Anyone of the panelists would like to make a comment? Thiru, would you like to make a comment over here?
I think
anybody over here using it?
iGrader. Anyone?
How long would the coding and conversion take, Dr. John?
So I was making some other apps earlier. I made a conference app for an Arvind Eye conference, and I already had the basic structure there. So it is basically a website. And once I had collected the data, making it into an app practically took only a couple of days work, which was spread out over 1 or 2 weeks. So yeah, 1 or 2 weeks, few hours a day.
And app training and background support, how are you trying to provide once somebody downloads this particular?
So this is an app which does not need any support other than updating the data. So I have an email address where they would send in suggestions or corrections. And if there is a correction, I just go to my source code, edit the source code, compile it, upload it, and it goes online. And Android has only a $25 one-time lifetime fee for becoming a developer. So that's why I took Android. And iPhone has $100 per year. It is not much if you look at it, but I didn't agree with the principle. That's why I have not put it in iPhone yet.
Yeah, iPhone is for expensive guys.
I think Thiru, common people like us take help of engineers. Legends like John, they do it themselves, everything.
Yeah, they pave the way. They pave the way for others. So even, I mean, all of us are in our own rights paving the way. So yeah, it's good to have one amongst us doing it for us, so he understands our language and it's easier to communicate.
Yes, sir. That is what I find is the most difficult
Try
thing when you
explaining
try to
LOCS,
communicate.
LOCS to a software engineer. You'll pluck all your hair.
Yeah,
So
they won't understand what is important. I have
Absolutely.
seen that happen all the time.
their
sir.
priorities are different from ours.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So can we go on to the next speaker? Dr. Kasturi here. If Dr. Kasturi or a co-author is not here, I think we should go on to the next one. Dr. Padmaja Kumari Rani, I can see you here. Yeah, so you'll be speaking on development of a mobile teleconsultation app, LVPI Connect Care. Wow, we've got so many apps already over here.
Yes.
Yeah.
1 second.
Do you have a problem sharing screen?
Yeah, 1 second and share. Can you see my screen, please?
Yeah, now you're good.
Yeah. Good evening. At the outset, I would like to thank AOS and Dr. Rohit Sethi for providing this opportunity. COVID pandemic was an opportunity for teleophthalmology for rising and healing from a distance, and HIPAA restrictions have been removed. And there was a lot of enabling environment in the form of introduction of telemedicine guidelines of India, and also development of various specialty specific guidelines. So at the tertiary level, during lockdown, we had a sudden sharp decline in the number of patients from an average of 1,500 per day to just 50. And then we launched immediately a teleconsulting portal. And telemedicine achieved 3 significant objectives during that time. One was triage, to see which patients actually need an in-person visit immediately, and management of medication. And recognizing the importance of teleophthalmology at a time of pandemic, we launched a mobile app-based telemedicine portal, Connect Care. With this app, our doctors now connect with the patients by clicking the button on their mobile phone, and all appointments are scheduled just like a virtual outpatient clinic. The patient schedules an appointment, uses the app. Using the app, they download the reports, they can upload their documents, consult the physician with the audio or video call. And we also have a home care portal wherein our vision technician team in the rural areas and our optometrist team in the urban areas reach elderly and also the disabled patients who can with disabilities. So the purpose of teleconsultation post-lockdown was mainly to reduce the follow-up visits. We made it at least one visit, post-surgical visit, as a teleconsult. So in order to reduce the congestion in our waiting halls, and also to improve the social distancing protocols, and also new patients who can be managed with the second opinions based on the reports. Before the development of app, we reached around 250 patients and 130 physicians to understand what is the current status of telemedicine. Our people are aware of telemedicine and its benefits, and how do people perceive telemedicine. So physician responses to the survey told that mobile phone was the major most common mode of outreach used by the patients, and the hurdles that are expressed by the physicians were that they cannot examine the eyes closely, and the vision assessment cannot be done thoroughly, and nearly 45% felt that there should be an upscale of the teleophthalmology services. And patient responses indicated again the mobile phone was the preferred phone of access, and around 40% of the respondents showed interest, and 33% were ambivalent or unsure about it. We also studied during the development of parallelly 5 teleconsult systems and applications to understand the patient flow and features. And top 3 user goals that were kept in mind during the development app was strengthening of the video call feature, because the patients always wanted a live communication, and explaining the process of teleconsultation in the form of FAQs on the website, and also a feature to upload documents also has been kept in mind. Thus, the ConnectCare app was born, and patient now can reach the LVP doctor in 3 easy steps: download the app, book an appointment, and join the call. Mobile, some of the important features that kept in mind on the patient front was to the mobile number to get on board. They can update the personal information. They can upload all their family members' profile also can be linked to the same account. They can upload reports, and they can stay updated with the appointment status reminders. Physicians can see all their appointments, and they can send e-prescriptions with the signature as per telemedicine guidelines, and receive the documents, and they can also stay updated about the appointment status. This is the team behind the ConnectCare and OSA digital team. And now we have an integrated ConnectCare, our EMR system at the primary level, ConnectCare, and also there is an upcoming referral doctor panel, all integrated into a single portal called Central Teleconsult Portal. Through this web-based portal version of ConnectCare, now we can see all visits, details of the patients while performing teleconsultation, and the appointment will just look like our OPD list. At tertiary level, we crossed 30,000 consults through the ConnectCare, and our consults are able to now reach various specialties are managed, and a cross-sector consultation is also possible. For example, this is the story of pneumococcal wherein the primary retina consult could cross the opinion to secondary oculoplastic consult and give the necessary advice to a patient who was in ICU. And this is the power of teleconsult, removing the barriers of access, distance. For example, this is a teleconsult from the train, and this is a diagnosing a congenital cataract, monitoring surgical follow-ups, which are through the photographs captured by the caregivers. And the journey continues to build people-centered eye care solutions so that all may see with excellence, equity, and efficiency. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Padmaja. And indeed, I think LVPI was one of the first to jump into this as soon as the pandemic opened up. We saw all that, and we did look up to the institutions to kind of take the lead, and because you have the infrastructure, you have the database, you have the cloud access, so you have the software people also with you to kind of ramp up your system. Often, I think it was more of the consultants catching up and the patients catching up. So how difficult was it to get patients on board?
I think during the lockdown, for example, the smoothest phase was this second wave. When, for example, in the first wave, we had a teleconsult portal where we had to reach our patients by calling ourselves through our mobile phones and filling the Excel sheets and tracking them through the Google record, and we could actually syncing that reports again into the main EMR was the most difficult. Whereas the second phase was just like because sitting at home, we were working from home, and we could have even 30 to 35 consults just lined up where we can talk to our patients who require any process or anything. And also it was the most smoothest process where everything EMR, because now we have integrated completely into EMR portal. So it's a web-based portal of ConnectCare. So where I can see the patient reports completely, and I can actually give whatever the advice, everything will be exactly like the regular patient care report.
Right.
So,
God forbid that there is no third wave. Others will get. I hope there is no third wave for us to make us better at this. Some things that we noticed even in our simple teleconsultations from the first wave to the second wave is that we were dropping a lot of protocol. Registration protocol laid down by the government, by the governing council of this thing, whatever they had. That was a huge document. Initially, I think we were all scared and more interested in the medical legal aspect of it. Did you also have a similar experience? Because the patients get annoyed by that registration protocol. They are more eager to tell their complaints and have them redressed. They are not interested in all that protocol. So how was it for you?
As I think we have actually laid down for each specialty, what are the conditions that can be managed by teleconsultation and what cannot be managed by teleconsultation. That specific guidelines are very important. And app also was just developed in accordance with the telemedicine guidelines. Like, for example, there has to be an informed consent, and there are the patients, for example, if you cannot do teleconsult, either party can actually deviate from the teleconsult, and we cannot do teleconsult for the international patients. So these are the challenges that we kept, and we also kept in our guidelines. And also we have to explain in the form of frequently asked questions in our website also to educate the patient. And this is an ongoing learning experience for
Yes.
both the patients as well as the consultants.
Yes, and even the backend, even the developers will be learning at the same time. Yeah, thank you very much. So we'll go on to the next presentation. Thiru, can you please tell us who's next?
If Kasturi is not there, then it's Dr. Pooja Khammar.
Dr. Pooja Khammar. Yes.
So very good evening to all. I would be talking today about the SARS-CoV-2 receptors and how they are present in the eye and how it can impact and its therapeutic potential. I have no financial disclosures here. So when COVID-19 came in during the first wave, we healthcare professionals were exposed to a lot of this, treating them. So what we were thinking is like how to prevent and protect the virus from entering our eye, because eye is one of the open surface which you can directly the virus can enter in. So based on the literature, we devised this prophylactic. First of all, we created this pathway, like how the receptors, the ACE2 receptors can bind your ocular surface, and how the TIMPRESS2 and the cathepsin receptors can intake this virus in, and how it can impact the eye. So this is just a pathway showing that. And we devised that where the chloroquine and trehalose drops will work to prevent it from damaging our ocular tissues. So this was just a work, but then when the things started opening up, we wanted to understand that whether the SARS-2 receptors are actually present in our ocular tissue or not, and if they are present, then what can be the possible topical targets to prevent the same, or possible systemic therapy. So what we did was, during eye donations, the eyes which were not suitable for transplantation, my colleagues, Dr. Poona, Dr. Gairik, Dr. Sharon, and Dr. Tirumalesh, all of us dissected the eyes in layers, starting from conjunctiva, cornea till retina, and retina was also further divided into neuroretina, RP, in the Bruch's membrane, and the choroid. And we took each of these tissues, they were stored in -80°C, and then they were studied for the gene expression analysis to see what the levels of the RNA are. And we also did immunofluorescence tests to see the specific proteins, and like ACE2 receptors, TIMPRESS2, MIX-A protein, which is the protective mechanism. So all this was done. I'll just come to results. What we found was that the ACE2 receptors, which are responsible for binding of the virus, was extremely higher on your ocular surface tissues like your conjunctiva, cornea, and corneal epithelium. Whereas as you move back towards the eye, like trabeculum meshwork, choroid, sclera, retina, and RP cells, the receptors reduced. So this suggested that there was a consistent and this was therefore TIMPRESS2 also, which is responsible for intake of the virus. And this was comparable to the lung epithelial tissue. We could get the lung epithelial tissue from our sister institute as well. Unfortunately, when the eye donation started, we wanted to prevent our doctors and everyone. So whenever we used to go for eye donations, disclaimer here, we only went for patients who were not giving any history of COVID. We used to take swab just for our precautions, and we used to bring them. And we did the RT-PCR test just to see whether there was any COVID there or not. The patients who were asymptomatic, did not have any COVID, they turned out to be positive on RT-PCR, and they had died of some natural cause or myocardial infarction. What we saw was that here, if you can see the conjunctiva, the red ones are the ACE2 receptors, and the green ones is the MIX-A protein, which is the protective phenomenon. In a control eye, this is how the healthy eye looks like, and this is a blood vessel. But a COVID positive eye, you can see a lot of these red colors, which is the ACE2 receptors, and you can hardly see the green color, which means your protective protein, the MIX-A protein, is absent. And in the COVID-19 recovered eye, like this is post-recovery, the ACE2 receptors started reducing, suggesting that it is healing and your receptors are reducing. However, this was in conjunctiva and cornea. However, this difference was not noted in retina. The next thing was the TIMPRESS and the cathepsin L gene also. Similar things were found here, that the TIMPRESS2 genes were higher and the cathepsin was higher in the COVID positive eye, started reducing on the COVID recovered eye. So this is just a representation of what receptors we found at each level, suggesting the surface had the higher chances of catching the infection, which matched the lung epithelium. Let's go back to our hypothesis. It was a hypothesis, but then various groups started publishing how tree yellows can work as an antiviral property in your eye. And we did some studies in the human corneal epithelial cell line and the adenocarcinomic basal epithelial cells. We took controls, and we also did chloroquine and tree yellows testing for ACE2 receptors and TIMPRESS2 gene and the cathepsin L and the MIX-A protein. What we found was that while treating them with chloroquine and tree yellows, the ACE2 receptors and the TIMPRESS2 receptors reduced basically. That means it will prevent your infection. Similarly, you can see here the same in cathepsin L. Whereas the MIX-A protein, MIX1 protein, which is the protective mechanism, again, it has an antiviral property. We didn't find any difference with chloroquine, but the receptors increase. That means that this is one of the potential targeted therapeutic for your eye when it comes to ACE2 receptors and COVID-19. So with this, I'll just stop my presentation, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Dr. Pooja. Anybody else would like to ask a question over here in the panel? Anybody would like to ask a question to Dr. Pooja? They are doing cutting edge research over here. And so are you trying to tell us that the eye is more susceptible to SARS-CoV-2 infection compared to, rather the conjunctiva and the cornea? The surface of the eye is more susceptible to infection than the other tissue in the eye and anywhere in the body?
As good as lungs, sir. It's the receptors are matching as well as the lungs. So what conjunctiva and cornea might catch is like conjunctivitis or any corneal infections. So just to prevent it, we can actually use one of these drops like tree yellows or chloroquine to protect our surface.
Now the consequences. Now in the lung, that leads to various increased secretion and fluid logging, the different mechanisms. So what happened over here now when if the SARS-CoV-2 does land up, the virus does get attached to the surface protein or the ACE2 receptors. What is the consequence on the conjunctiva? What is the kind of cascade or the chain reaction that follows? Is there an increased secretion, or there is dryness, or what follows?
One thing which we have been seeing is increased dryness. A lot of this COVID recovered patients, they call back and tell us that, they have, like, apart from your retinal and other conditions, which are altogether a different ball game, for corneal ocular surface conditions, we are seeing a lot more dry eye patients. And they're not typically your dry eye patients. They have a lot of discomfort and burning sensation. So basically, this means that, probably they have, their ACE2 receptors and all were affected with COVID. And the recovery is delayed, and that's why post-COVID recovery, they have all these symptoms. So we see a lot of this changes. One thing which we have noted is.
So what I'm trying to, the question is which came first, whether there was a direct infection of the virus onto the conjunctival surface, or it was a systemic SARS-CoV-2 infection which led to this.
Interesting question, sir. But
because see, we don't know, because we don't know what came first, whether as the person had a pulmonary or upper respiratory infection exposure to SARS-CoV-2, the person also had the same kind of viral exposure to the conjunctiva and every other place. So whether it was a direct consequence or an indirect consequence will remain debatable.
It will remain debatable.
Can I take the question, sir?
Unless you do a kind of on animal models or something like that, do this exposure, which I think we'll have to do so eventually, the way we are heading.
I pray COVID goes away till then.
Let's see, we are playing hard. Yeah, thank you.
The Wuhan whistleblower, the guy actually got conjunctivitis first.
Yeah, we know that.
What Pooja showed was very impressive, that the ACE receptors present on the conjunctiva as rich as in the lung, which means that eye can be a portal of entry. That's why we have to keep our eye protected with the patient.
Thiru, I do agree with the reports that are there that he had conjunctivitis and this and that. But tell me, in our practical experience, how many, all of you from all institutions across, we have so many panelists, how many of you have seen conjunctivitis as a presenting feature of SARS-CoV-2 followed by a pulmonary infection? None of us. None of us.
That's true.
But our eye also has that protective.
Welcome back. We'll have you on soon.
Our eye has also the receptors of the MICSA protein, which are a protective phenomenon. So probably that is the one which is trying to fight the infection and prevent it from catching. But
so the question is whether the conjunctivitis that he had was a kind of coincidence.
I don't think it was
so anyway,
yeah.
Taima, you can relax. I think we're running well ahead of time. So since Dr. Kasturi is here, we'll have Dr. Kasturi's. Thank you, Pooja. We'll catch up on this later.
Yes.
We'll have Dr. Kasturi speak on her topic. You can share your screen.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, please. So
Screen. Okay.
Yeah. Please go ahead with your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a big honor for me to speak in this forum which is very close to my heart, the research and innovations. So I'll be speaking what innovations happening in orbital surgery and how I am involved in it. So the 4 major innovations in orbital surgery are basically, one is the 3D printing, second is the navigation guidance, the third is the robotic surgery, and the fourth is the AR and the VR, which is really something which is making a big change in orbital surgery. So what I want to insist that I'll just start with the 3D printing and the navigation that we are being doing at Sri Shankardev Netralaya. So 3D printing, I'm using it extensively for the customized reconstruction, especially when there's a fracture of the orbital walls. And these orbital walls, which a very severe fracture involving both the vertical matrices and the horizontal matrix, as you can see here, the whole of the eyeball is being involved, and especially when there is impure fracture, the fracture involving the orbital rim, the fracture involving the multiple walls leading to a comminuted fracture. So these are the situation where we do need to use a 3D printing, which helps to realign the buttress, release the entrapment, and reconstruct and reform the fractured orbital walls. So what is this 3D printing? This 3D printing is basically we have a 2D image in the DICOM format, and then this is being followed by conversion to the 3D images, where we take the CT scan in different forms and we convert it into 3D images in all 360 degree once we view it. And these 3D images are now next converted to 3D modeling and then exported into the surface tessellation format. And from the surface tessellation format, we get the 3D printing. So in situation like this, when you have a big fracture involving the NOE, the supraorbital rim, the infraorbital rim, the pan fracture, this navigation will not help. This is where the 3D really comes into play. And these are some of the images of the 3D reconstruction that I have been using as Sri Shankardev Netralaya with the orbital fracture, where the application is not only for the fracture, but also it is used as an education tool and also in the management of the anophthalmic socket. Like situation like this child, when he comes to me, is such a bad situation. You can see the whole of the eyeball is being subluxated down. There's a canthal dystopia and there's a fracture medial and the inferior wall. And once you see the 3D pictures, and this is how it has really helped us in navigating along with doing a 3D reconstruction. So once I was doing the navigation, this is how we do a mirroring. I'll come to you later. I have measured, this is the normal, the blue is the normal orbit. Other one is a blowout orbit following a fracture. And then once you measure that how much amount of reconstruction is required, and then once you go ahead with the surgery and you put the appropriate amount of volume, which is usually measured with the navigation system and also with the 3D remodeling that we have, and then you can get a very appropriate correction. And this is how the child looks after approximately a week, and this is how he looks after approximately a month. So along with these fractures, it is also very much useful for the contracted socket, especially in situation like this, where you really need to do a 3D printing and see how much amount of contracture, and you see this difference of at least 10 millimeter in both the socket. And this is a difficult situation because this patient has undergone multiple operations in multiple parts of the country, and he does not have the inferior orbital wall, and he does not have any of the socket tissue. So you need to give the socket tissue, you need to form the infraorbital wall. And now because you have a 3D system where you know that there's so much of contracture, I have devised a very innovative surgery. What I have done, I have cut the whole of the inferior maxillary wall and rotated it anteriorly so that this has given some volume to the socket and made this socket deep. So once you have measured that how much amount of socket contracture is there, you also need to plan that how much amount of volume you'll give, and this will not help with the graft. You need a flap which has a blood supply to it, and the best is a temporalis muscle. So this is what you can see. Yeah, on this. This is what you can see how we had to cut the whole of the maxilla, and the maxilla is then rotated anteriorly along with the temporalis muscle transfer, and somehow you can end up giving him a good prosthesis. So in many situations, I also say the cutting edge technology is navigation in many situations, which is basically a GPS system where all the data you have in the CD, it can be a CT, it can be MRA, it can be MRI, and then you incorporate it into the console, and this console helps you do a surgery in very complex situation, especially in the optic canal region or in the superior orbital fissure. And you know this is very difficult, hard to reach area, and these are often being fractured by a shearing force. Also, it may be fractured by also multiple comminutive fracture, as you can see here. So navigation is one of the technology which has helped us not only the mirroring and going for a very good reconstruction in cases of a fracture, but also it has also helped us to do challenging situation like optic neuropathy. Just one slide, I'll show you.
Please, take your time.
I can take, then let me show you this. Like this is a situation, see, this is so challenging. When you have something like a fracture in the frontal bone, it's very difficult. We don't want to go, because when the frontal sinus bleeds, it bleeds so profusely, it can lead to anything on the table. But as because I have the navigation, see, I can guide, I have drawn, this is the plane, how do I enter? And with very minimal manipulation, I can go and reach to this frontal bone, which is the whole of the foreign body. This is a big palate, and with very, very minimal manipulation, because I have drawn the whole of the cylinder, the pathway, how do I enter, and this has helped me to remove the foreign body somewhere very near to the brain. And another important thing I would like to show, see, this is a traumatic optic neuropathy. I was doing the decompression. See, when I put my stylet, my navigation stylet is not entering the optic canal. So this shows, this is guiding me that my surgery is not complete. So what I need to do, you can see in the sagittal, see, it has not reached the roof. So I have gone for further decompression. I went down to the optic canal, and I had de-roofed the superior orbital wall. And now once you see now I'm placing my navigation stylet in the actually, you can see from the orbital to the cranial part. In the coronal also, you can see it is going to the roof of the optic canal, and also in the sagittal you can see very well. So these are some of the technological advances and the innovation, and I feel without this you cannot take over the challenging situations. Thank you very much for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Kasturi. Anybody in the panel would like to ask a question? We have some time, so if somebody wants to ask, we have time till 6:25 for the session. So, Dr. Kasturi, John, you are into 3D printing. John, are you still around?
Yes, sir. Yes, I am. Yes, sir.
So, Kasturi, I'll kick off a question, and then maybe John. What material are you using? Thermoplastic, of course. So, what material are you using for orbital reconstruction?
No, there are different ways. Actually, what we do, we give the DICOM. It is not I'm doing. There's a person from IIT Guwahati. They actually do it for us. We just give them CT, and sometimes they can customize it. The same biopore implant that we are using, they can have a fragmentation. They do a auto segmentation, and they can customize it. How much amount of thickness that we need to create.
No, what I'm asking is what biocompatible material are you using? Because you're going to leave that.
That's yeah.
What's it?
Polypropylene.
Polypropylene. Okay. PP. Okay. Yeah. So that's fine. So John, you have a question?
I am interested in 3D printing. I did a little bit of 3D printing. I didn't want to put anything into the human body because I was not sure of the biocompatibility issues. So most of what I've done is things which don't go into the body. But the OMFS department here in Ramchandra Medical College, they are trying to get into this. I think they would love to get in touch with you. I would definitely recommend, I'll tell them to contact you.
It will be wonderful. You know, we really want the customized implant, which we are not getting. We are getting the 3D skull, but to have a customized implant, which is accepted by the body, and the same material, the Medport, that is polypropylene, if we can use it, it will really help us because it gives a very good tissue integration.
John, you can't be saying that you're scared of putting in a 3D printed material. People are having a beating heart 3D printed now. So I think we are not very far from that. So.
The printers which I have access to are all PLA.
Not a tissue printer.
I have a resin printer which is quite toxic. So I'm putting everything in Modelize and
I know. I know.
I don't have the bio printer yet.
Thiru, I think, shall we call the next speaker?
Next speaker is Dr. Shreyas Ramamurthy.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I have another session. I'll leave and go to the next.
Thank you, Dr. Kasturi. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, one and all. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Rohit Shetty, AIOS, and all the panelists for having me over here. Today, I'm going to be presenting some of the initial encouraging results of a journey which started almost 8 years ago, a concept brought about in LV Prasad. So essentially, a keratoprosthesis, when we talk about a keratoprosthesis, the most commonly used one is a type 1 K-Pro, which is useful for bilateral corneal blindness, ocular surface failure in wet eyes. But when we come to bone dry eyes, like Stevens-Johnson syndrome, ocular cicatricial pemphigoid, very severe thermal and chemical industrial accidents, in such cases, we cannot do a type 1 K-Pro. And the only existing options available are either a modified osteodontokeratoprosthesis, which is a very challenging and two-stage procedure, requires a great deal of technical skill and a prolonged procedure. The second option is the Boston type 2 keratoprosthesis, which is a elegant option, but unfortunately, the Boston type 2 is not widely available commercially for most corneal surgeons to use. So the essential idea is that we need to have a stable cover to protect the underlying K-Pro, and we could potentially use the patient's own pannus or fibrovascular tissue or a mucous membrane graft as a cover to do this. So I'll just present this quickly with the one particular video and then go on to share the subsequent results. So this is a patient with a toxic epidermonecrolysis 2 years post the primary episode. And you can see he has a thick pannus and you can hardly even notice where the globe is. So you start by trying to lift the entire dermalized pannus. The whole idea in lifting this pannus is to ensure that it is thick enough and you are lifting it off in its entirety and trying to maintain its vascularity. It's very, very important that we don't buttonhole this. If we buttonhole, there's a higher chance of melt. Subsequently, you try and remove and dissect the pannus, which is above the cornea. You really can't even make out in the initial stage where the possible potential cornea is. And that's why a layer by layer dissection is important for us to know where the cornea lies and where the pupil lies. Because unless your K-Pro is centered over the pupil, the entire result of the surgery is not going to be useful. So subsequent to that, you go ahead and do the regular surgery like a type 1 K-Pro. We do a lensectomy, leave the patient aphakic, leave the PC intact, and go ahead and implant the type 1 K-Pro. So in these patients where I'm doing it underneath the pannus, we are using a type 1 K-Pro because the pannus itself is not very thick. And the pannus has limited proliferative capacity and therefore does not keep growing over the K-Pro itself. So you can then suture over the pannus entirely and completely close the case and subsequently leave this for a period of 6 weeks. And once this is healed completely, you can then make the central opening. While making the central opening, it's extremely important that we are cautious that we don't open an excess area beyond the cylinder and expose the graft, and only the area of the front plate is opened up. And any excess opening can be sutured back and the pannus is allowed to seal, and that is the end of the procedure. Yeah, so this is the post-operative picture of the patient, and this patient has been maintaining, fortunately by God's grace, a 20/20 vision of almost 6 years. And we've extended this to numerous indications. This is an extensive thermal injury where the patient's own conjunctival pannus has been used as a flap to restore. Although this is a relatively more wet eye, the initial injury insult is so severe, but that there is not just a limbal epithelial deficiency, but there is also a conjunctival deficiency. And therefore, just doing a type 1 K-Pro is not very good in these patients. This is yet another patient where we had a bilateral thermal injury. And this patient also did very well using this. And this is a patient with a OCP with a thinner pannus. In these patients with a thinner pannus, you cannot use the pannus itself as a cover. So you need to implant a mucous membrane graft first. And once the mucous membrane graft has been made, you can raise the MMG. But in these cases, we are using what we call a LVP K-Pro, which has an elevated cylinder where the mucous membrane graft tucks underneath this. And as you can see in this postoperative picture, the cylinder is exposed and is at the level of the mucous membrane graft. So this has been extended to about 8 patients now. I've been using the type 1 K-Pro when I do the underneath the pannus in SJS, whereas in OCP, where you typically have a thinner pannus, you have to do a mucous membrane graft and then do the same procedure with a LVP type K-Pro. So the challenges are a mucosal overgrowth, Glaucoma is another challenge. It requires regular fundus examination. In 2 of these patients, we've had to implant a glaucoma drainage device under the mucosa. You have to watch out for retraction and graft exposure during the early postoperative period. To sum up, it's a viable option in bone dry eyes. It's easily available. It is low cost, and you could do it as a single or 2-stage procedure. It's technically an easier procedure than the other surgeries, and it is a smaller transition for corneal surgeons in such extreme scenarios. Thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Dr. Sreyash. Anyone in the panel would like to make a comment or ask a question? Not my area of work, so I'm absolutely unfamiliar with this, but I guess the results that you've shown are fantastic, and I'm sure it's benefiting a lot of patients. So if nobody has a question or a comment, we'll go on to the next. Dr. Tirumalesh is next.
Thank you.
So thank you, Dr. Sreyash. So we will have Dr. Tirumalesh speak on my experience working with animal imaging for translation sites.
I would, at the outset, thank the innovation session panel, Dr. Rohit Shetty and Dr. Suven and others involved for giving me this opportunity. My journey into translational research has been guided by Dr. Rohit and Dr. Arko. So as we all know, translational research is something where you take the information from the patients and you go to the bench, you think about it, and then you develop something new and come back to the bedside. So in our quest to understand macular edema, we were collecting aqueous humor from patients and we were analyzing what was happening. And we developed this important thing about, knowing the clinical status, knowing about the region, know the cellular players, what happens at the junction and how the signaling works. And based on this, we developed the molecular signaling pathway. So as we all know, diabetic retinopathy is something which is very commonly seen in the clinic. There are a few knowledge gaps in disease progression and how anti-VEGF resistance develops, and are the available treatable options enough in treating our patients. So based on the knowledge that we had collected based on the aqueous humor analysis, we had a hypothesis that there are distinct set of soluble factors in the aqueous humor in different patients with different or various stages of disease. And the added hypothesis was that dysregulated factors can either augment VEGF-dependent angiogenesis and vascular leakage, or they might facilitate a VEGF-independent angiogenesis and vascular leakage in driving diabetic retinopathy progression. So those were the hypotheses. Based on this, we had a few objectives where we wanted to determine the soluble factor profile in the aqueous samples from different diabetic retinopathy patients with non-proliferative and proliferative forms. We also collected the aqueous from patients who had resistance to anti-VEGF management and in different types of macular edema patients. So the data was profiled based on these patient samples. And what we did was we looked at the cellular analysis, developed a mechanistic pathway, and kind of did an in vitro experiment and then an animal experiment. So this is how we did that. We collected aqueous humor from patients and vitreous from patients who were undergoing vitreous surgery for membrane peelings and all that. And then we stored it at -80. And once we reached our target and grouping, we performed the multiplex ELISA, and based on that, the results were formulated. So the 108 factors that we analyzed were broadly classified into pro-angiogenic, anti-angiogenic, pro-inflammatory, and anti-inflammatory. Although these groups have interacting kind of soluble factors. So this was our multivariate analysis where we saw that these were the molecules where cytokines, soluble adhesion molecules, growth factors were all part of the disease pathogenesis. So based on the analysis that we did, what we found out was there was one particular molecule, for now we will call it as soluble factor X, was along with anti-VEGF playing a very important role in patients who were both treatment naive, non-responders to treatment, and also was causing a problem in the vasculature. As we all know, diabetic retinopathy is a vascular disorder. So why we chose soluble factor X was for these reasons. That primary mechanism of this particular factor, that caused vision decline in diabetic retinopathy was because of edema and pathological angiogenesis. So the common known agent is vascular endothelial growth factor, but this also had a similar kind of an action. So therefore, the endothelial dysfunction is strongly associated with DR pathobiology, and this particular factor had a very gross effect on this particular endothelium. So for in vitro confirmation, we used the endothelial cells from the human endothelial cells from the embryos, and we use these cells to induce tube formation, barrier loss, pro-angiogenic and pro and anti-angiogenic factor secretion. And these were the pathways of signaling cascade which were studied, which were ERK2, P38, JNK, AKT2, NF kappa beta, and SMA. So based on this, we first induced diabetes in mice by injecting them with streptozocin, and we waited for 16 to 20 weeks. And once the injection was done and we confirmed that the mice had retinopathy, we injected the molecule. So the molecule which I called factor X was recombinant intracellular ICAM1, and we also used a neutralizing antibody, and in one of the group we used the antagonist. So the animals had diabetes that was confirmed by looking at the blood sugar levels, and this is our animal lab imaging setting, which we have set it up ourselves, and we initially imaged them. How do we identify that the patients had diabetes was that they tend to develop a very mature kind of a cataract, and once the period of DR is confirmed, we give the injection in the lab. So I'll show you the results of the lab in a single slide. So this is the first one where there was no streptozocin induced, which means that these were healthy rats. When we induced these were the image of a rat which had streptozocin injection done, and you can see that there is some amount of diabetes changes that is there. And we gave a PBS along with it, which is nothing but buffered solution. And in one of the slides, you can see that along with streptozocin, we gave ICAM, and the leakage that was found was very high. And when we gave an antagonist in that particular, in another set of rats where we had given STZ, along with the antagonist of this one, which was LFA, we found that it neutralized it and made it as though the rat nearly did not have any diabetes. So this is a new drug which has a very promising kind of outlook. So once we do the proof of concept and we confirm the dosage and how long it can last in the eye, so this can be taken up for phase 1 clinical trials in humans. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Dr. Thiru. I know if are there any retinal surgeons over here who would like to ask a question. If not, I'll ask you a question. I'm not much of a translational scientist, but I'm just curious. See, in your samples that you collected from the diabetic patients,
yes,
the soluble factor X or ICAM that you said was present in the samples. So when you induced diabetes in these animals, the same factor was there in those animals also.
In the primary ICAM is not directly known to be driving it like VEGF, but
did you since you injected ICAM further to
so why we added ICAM was that ICAM increases the progression of the disease. We had to prove that concept also, that it might be such that ICAM that we found in the vitreous and aqueous, people might say that it might be a function, that it was opportunistically present, and it.
So it was a coincidence, or it's not a coincidence. There's a cause and effect relationship.
Proof that ICAM does progress it, and the soluble ICAM which is there in both the aqueous and vitreous had progressed. So that was one proof of concept that we were trying to prove. And the second part was when we gave the ICAM antagonist, what happened was it took it back to the previous levels where there was not much leakage at all. So it looked as though the diabetic retinopathy severity was like went back a couple of stages down.
So now we will have some more things to inject. We have anti-VEGFs, now we'll have anti-ICAM or anti-soluble factor X.
Oh.
Thank you very much for that enlightening presentation, Thirumalesh. We'll now go on to the last speaker, Dr. Vineet Joshi. He's been patiently waiting. Dr. Vineet, you can start your screen share.
Thank you, Dr. Suvain and Dr. Thirumalesh for inviting me. Thank you, Dr. Rohit Shetty, for this opportunity. And my talk is in line with all the beautiful software apps that we have seen so far during this COVID-19 pandemic. Great innovations so far. So what I'm going to take you through is a story of a product which we have been developing since last 1 year. And let's have a look at this. Imagine if a patient is able to send you a video and a photo like this from the interiors of his home and villages, sitting right there, and you're able to do a teleconsultation like this. Isn't that something that you would want in these times of lockdowns and saving the visit for the patients? So how did we reach till here? Now, when the lockdown started, as Dr. Padmaja mentioned in her Connect Care talk, there was a storm of patients who were sending us photos using their smartphones. So they had the means, but they lacked the knowledge as to what is exactly the clinicians needed to make a decision. As you can see, we had a lot of images coming in which lacked the clinical frame of interest, or there was a shake, lack of focus, inappropriate lighting conditions, and magnifications. As a result, 84% of images were not up to the clinical standard grade. So we analyzed up to 340 images and we did our study, and we tried to figure out what could be a universal solution which can be portable, a stable solution, a hardware as well as a software that can sit on any phone of the patient on their camera, and it will be on a secure sharing platform, engaging the patient to consistently send standard clinical grade photographs. That's where the idea of Grabby was born. So Grabby is basically a hardware paired with a software which is designed for patients to use from their home to connect with the doctors. So there was a team which was constantly seeing the standard smartphone images as well as the images clicked using Grabby and comparing it with the gold standards of slit lamp with the best possible technology available, trying to standardize these images and all obviously taking the cost effectivity into the picture. So a design team, clinicians and support care staff, software developers, and many of the manufacturers and operations were involved with primarily bringing the patient into the focus. We compared our images with the gold standard of the slit lamp, and we found that, okay, there were encouraging results. More than 50% of the images showed that if slit lamp photo is 100% quality mark, we were reaching somewhere up to 60 to 70% of the images within the 90% quality of this gold standard images. Also, we could achieve an clinician acceptance rate of 60% with the initial trial run. So we devised a protocol by which we can fix this attachment to any smartphone, and we figured out the camera adjustments that can actually help a patient to get a good photograph. And we established this protocol and distributed these among the patients. And as you can see, there was a significant improvement in the quality of the images sent by patients from their home post-operatively. And this helped to save us their visits. Now, in the upcoming phases, what we are trying to do is convert this protocol into a software which will be able to directly upload these images and link with the EMR, and it will be uploaded in the patient's file, and also upgrade our hardware to a magnifier lens along with a standard illumination, which also has a blue LED for ocular surface staining procedures. With that, so these were the images that we obtained with the newer version, which is an effortless and clear documentation. It can document all the anterior segment findings very clear, so much so that you can also point out a loose suture at 7 o'clock. Now, we asked the patients to record videos, and as you can see, it was a seamless experience for them, smooth with no shake at all. You can actually make out the margins of the corneal ulcer. You cannot miss out a single corneal vessel in that whole scenario. And this was the difference that we achieved. On the left, you can see the image captured by just a smartphone. On the right, with the latest hardware and the software module. This is the same patient which I showed you in the beginning. He's sitting in the interiors of Maharashtra. We trained his son to capture the images, and he was able to send us the photos like this. There's a girl. We trained her father. She was affected by Pythium keratitis, and luckily we were able to manage it during the lockdown when they couldn't travel to us using this device. We were able to give them proper management. Imagine a Down syndrome child who is very uncooperative, not allowing anybody to touch, but with the help of device and with the trust with his own parents, we were able to see that it was a case of hydrops, and we could document the findings very easily. So it had many advantages. So in the future, who are the players? Patients as well as doctors, as well as the primary healthcare workers. Everyone with a smartphone in the pocket are going to be benefited by it. And with the app, everything is going to be linked to the EMR. So with the latest development, we figured out that the confidence in quality of imaging was up to 70%, and we got it, the time employed in it was very less. So combined with the Connect Care platform that we have, as Dr. Padmaja mentioned, this could be the beginning of teleconsultation 2.0, and it has its advantages in standardizing the quality of imaging, decreasing the healthcare expenditure, and digitalization of newer algorithms on images. So this was the the product. So Grabby, which was made to save a visit for the patient. Thank you. You're on mute, Dr. Sen.
Sorry. Yeah.
So you're muted. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you very much for that presentation, Dr. Vineet. You just elevated the level of care. And I do appreciate the fact that videos by patients is very difficult. They can take stills because they can kind of pinch it out and do that. But videos, we found it very difficult. So just tell me something. The hardware is a clip-on spacer, basically.
Yes.
It's a clip-on spacer. And
Yes.
it's compatible with all smartphones, the same distance for all smartphones?
Yes. We actually tested on all different companies of smartphones, and we figured out a distance that works literally on all of them. So luckily for us, ophthalmic imaging anterior segment, we get that depth of focus is kind of forgiving for us. So that particular distance works for most of the phones.
Yeah. So for the videos also, it on all smartphone platforms is the same, is it?
Yes. Video is more informative in all the ways.
We have been struggling to get any videos from our patients because when it comes to videos and they can't zoom it up and they find it difficult. So it's I think it'll be very relevant. Thank you very much.
That's the advantage of the app. We have pre-configured the settings. All they have to do is just tap.
Oh, great. Dr. Chaitra, your last comments.
Sorry to interrupt.
I've just
but
come
we are
in time
running.
for the vote of thanks. I'm so sorry. I had 2 other sessions I was juggling between, and I'm so grateful to both of you all for handling this. And I think Dr. Rohit also was busy. So some of the sessions got rescheduled and hence this issue. I'm really sorry. Excellent presentations. I'm going to go back and see on and off. I just kept coming between to see. I'm sure there's lots to learn. And the nicest thing is they're all such youngsters. So I'm sure they have a long way to go. And they'll have a lot more to present every other year. So congratulations to all the innovators, budding innovators, and the senior ones sitting there and guiding them.
Now, I'm glad we have platforms like this because these are kind of places where people can share their ideas and grow from here, So the AIS didn't have these options earlier. So this is wonderful, wonderful. Thank you all presenters. Thank you, Rohit, Chaitra, and all presenters. Thiru for being my running mate. So thank you. So let's close the session. I think this must be the last session of AIS.
Yes. No, there are more. It goes on till 8. Yes.
Oh, wow. Right. Thank you.
All the best, everybody. Bye.
Thank you. Yeah, bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Chaitra.
Bye.
Thank you so much, everybody.